So welcome everyone, and I want to introduce Georgina Stewart, who's a professor of philosophy and education, I believe, in New Zealand. And I came across her papers when I was doing a search on Indigenous philosophy for this course, and was really excited by what she's writing. And I thought it would be great if she could talk to us in Maine about her ideas and maybe inspire us to make as much progress as the Maoris have made in New Zealand, I think. I think they're ahead of us. But if we work hard to catch up, maybe we will someday. So, Georgina, would you like to say a little bit more about yourself, please?
Kia ora, welcome. Thank you for having me, and I'm delighted to be here. And my people come from the far north of New Zealand, of Aotearoa. In Māori terms, that part of the country is known as the tail of the fish, which is interesting, really, because if you look at a map of the of New Zealand, which is made up of two main islands. The North Island, which is the one that I'm speaking about and where I'm speaking to you from, is it actually maps really, really well onto a sort of an outline of the Pacific dolphin, actually. So that kind of it's those are the sorts of things that interest me. How did our ancestors, who were not able to fly, so accurate as to their knowledge of the shape of the island from above, from an aerial view? And there is a tradition actually in our people of astral travel, as I think there probably also is in many other indigenous traditions. So I
Indeed.
work as my background is is as a school teacher, but I also studied science to master's level in chemistry as a school leaver, uh, and um, and I now work as well. I've been in the School of Education and recently migrated into the School of Māori Studies at the Auckland University of Technology, which is actually it's a post-millennial university. So it kind of sits on the edges of the University of Auckland, which is the largest kind of the dinosaur that occupies most of the space in the university landscape where I am. So yeah, nice to be here. The background, actually, I should say, is just a typical view of the coastal area in the far north of New Zealand, where my roots are on my father's side.
Thank you. You know, the same thing occurred with the Lakota people who accurately mapped the shape of the Black Hills in South Dakota without being able to fly above them physically. And the Lakota map is completely accurate. So I think our indigenous four ancestors had skills that perhaps we don't use as much today, but hopefully could cultivate. And perhaps they could return someday.
Perhaps, although I think it's well established that as human beings have developed technological extension of the human physical senses, those senses have weakened. For example, in Māori traditions, there were names for the moons of Saturn, for the rings of Saturn, some of the moons of Saturn, and moons of Jupiter, and so forth. So that's an example where, and I mean, I'm just mentioning here astronomy because it's the one kind of field of science that Indigenous peoples throughout history have developed has been part of Indigenous culture. So that's an example where what we consider visible with the naked eye today is nothing compared with what our ancestors would have seen as watchers of the night skies.
Yes, tremendous abilities that have not been cultivated to the degree today that they were once upon a time, I think.
Well, and then of course the problem is that so much of that knowledge has been lost. Though
Mm.
not as much as it's always interesting when science assumes that all of that Indigenous knowledge is completely died out amongst the communities, and that is just another kind of scientific assumption that is not quite true.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly speaking, I mean, one of, I mean, you mentioned kind of we're ahead of you and that sort of thing. My experience is that it's not only impossible but actually unconstructive to compare one Indigenous culture with another, or to put them in a category, lump them into a category. And this is something that has come up a bit for me, where I've been put in the position where I've been expected to speak on behalf of Indigenous people or to generalize about Indigenous knowledge. And that is often a sort of a Western demand or command that I've learned to resist. Actually, Lewis, I find the only thing that Indigenous cultures have in common is the traumatic kind of interface with Western cultures. And just as Westerners would not like to think of themselves as all being the same, I think Indigenous even more so. In fact, Western culture almost sticks out as the exception to what we might think of as more normal human culture represented by the range of Indigenous cultures around the world. So, from that point of view, I have developed a position of resisting and refusing to generalize what I know about my culture to all Indigenous cultures. And when you think about it, nobody actually considers themselves, like, you don't introduce yourself by saying, I'm Indigenous. So the term Indigenous and the concept of Indigenous itself is a placeholder that only makes sense when you resource it with the actual cultural uh, resources that from which you make up your identity. So a bit of a rave there on that kind of concept of Indigenous, which I think can be quite problematic.
Right, right. You remind me of Brian Burkhart, who wrote a book on how Indigenous philosophy is always local and not universal.
Yes, and universalism is the thing that kind of marks out the Western culture. Although, I mean, is it universal, or is it majoritarianism masquerading as universalism?
Right, right,
I mean, the Europeans were pretty much the only kind of cultural group that kind of that claim to have developed a form of knowledge, i.e., science and technology, that supersedes and sort of like subsumes every other form of knowledge.
right, right.
So
So,
then people always ask me then, well, people always raise the kind of the weaknesses of relativism, but I get around that by talking about a sort of a restricted range. So it's not that we want to throw science away, and that's something that I've been accused of quite recently, of attacking science simply for pointing out the role that science played in the colonization of Maori, and to so that's the kind of reminding Western or scientists of that kind of association that science has had with colonization. In my case, of Maori people, of course, the same thing happened around the rest of the world as well. And yet you remind a scientist of that, and the scientist becomes extremely offended, and I've been accused of attacking science for that. But for me, it's not attacking science, but it's holding science to the truth of its own, its own past. And if we can't accept our past, then it seems to me we don't have much hold on the truth.
Indeed.
I'm
So,
sure you've thought about all these things too, Lewis.
oh, for sure. So where I wanted to head, what's really of interest to me is indigenizing philosophy of mind. And I'm not even sure if mind is a good indigenous concept. I'm struggling with that a little bit, but maybe consciousness would be better, or awareness. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit to Maori concepts of whatever it is that we call mind or awareness or consciousness within or connected with the physical body.
In Māori traditions, the human being has two parts, the physical and the metaphysical, for want of a better word. These are portrayed very simply by the words wai tahi and wairua. So the way I work is to, because I am a speaker of the language, and a language, a natural ethnic language encapsulates the kind of the worldview within which I believe frameworks of philosophy are to be found. So I find it very productive to um, refer to uh, language points to show me the way towards traditional Māori thought. Um, so, with those two parts, the physical and the metaphysical, um, come other sorts of schemas. For example, the word the word that has been sort of standardized to mean the mind today also has traditional meanings of the spleen or various parts of uh, the the guts, to put it bluntly, and I'm it reminds me not to get all sort of new agey about it, but that concept that sort of that I contacted through sort of interest in some of those new age type concepts of the body mind. And I think that's interesting because of what the Cartesian, the Western, the sort of basis of modern Western thinking is that split between body and mind, which in traditions like Maori thinking doesn't exist. So I've thought about this in terms of training the young mind into the way of culture and cultural knowledge. There is a usefulness in the binary to say it's this and not that. And I think what Western culture has done is create this kind of split, this set of binaries through that mind body split. So we get, intellect over physicality, and then that kind of gets elaborated to male versus female, and so on and so forth, even to the point of the white person being seen as more evolved, more intellectual, and the coloured people of the world being seen as less evolved, more physical. So, for instance, in Maori and in New Zealand, there is a kind of a mythology that Maori and Pacific people are naturally good at physical sports. I mean, we love rugby here, which is a full contact sport. And so there's this, there are these kind of myths really about things like the warrior gene and the idea that Maori have a sort of an inbuilt advantage to those sorts of things. But so I think what I find about Maori philosophy is the need to sort of peel back the layers of the colonized ways of thinking that we have been brought up with. But for me, being Maori, I also think of it as a little bit like a sort of I use the term mental escape hatch. So even though living in Maori lifestyles, just as with Indigenous American, I dare say, became just impossible many generations ago. I mean, in order to survive, our ancestors had to adopt Western ways of living, Western foods and clothing and shelter and so forth. But that's why I think Indigenous philosophy or Maori philosophy is so interesting, because it's the one thing that we still have control over is our thought processes. So in one's own kind of understanding of who one is and one's relationship to the world, to be Maori for me is to um, have a sense and not just respect, because I think that word is so overused, but a real understanding and commitment to different origin stories and different um, understandings of who we are, what the human being is, and our relationship to other living and non-living elements of the world.
Right. When we were in East Gippsland in Australia, we met a Gurnai elder named Albert, and he told us that there were 405 creation stories in Australia, and they were all true for the people who told them in the place where they're told. And I just thought that was a profound teaching that I've never forgot.
It's difficult to overestimate the size of Australia. I mean, it is as big as the United States. It is an enormous landmass, and it's a very harsh environment and climate. So I think those kinds of physical, geographical, environmental characteristics help us to understand the way in which the cultures of that land are very located and local. Not really coming into broad contact with each other. Maori culture is different, although there are some phrases and some slight variations in words, but speakers of Te Reo Māori from around the whole of Aotearoa, New Zealand, can understand each other. And in fact, the early Maori linguists called the Maori language a dialect of the Pacific language. And if we look at Samoan, Tongan, Rarotongan, and Niuean and Tokelau, those languages are all, there's so many overlaps. It's impossible to deny that kind of philosophical genealogy and relationship.
And in
And
fact,
words like, I just want to say a word like, there are two really important concepts. One is mana, M-A-N-A, mana, and the other one is tapu, which has been appropriated into English as taboo. And both of those concepts, very profound Indigenous concepts that relate to philosophy, and those are shared, they're in common across all of those Pacific languages and cultures.
and there, interestingly enough, there is a group in Tualaip, Washington, in the United States, who speak a language very similar to Maori, and can understand Maori and can be understood by Maori. So
Is that over in the sort of Vancouver,
yes,
Seattle,
yes, it is.
the Salish? Is it?
Mhm.
I have heard of those. There's been some very productive collaborations and meetups. I haven't got the full picture on that particular one though.
Yes, yes. So getting back getting back to this notion of mind, um, so I'm interested in learning about how well, particularly with you, how Maori un- understand mind. And so, for example, in in Lakota thought about mind is that it's composed of a swarm of stories, and each of which contain a spark of the being who told those stories, and that the stories come together in a particular context for a particular purpose, and then disassemble and wait for another context and another purpose. And so I'm really interested in how Maori conceive of mind or identity or self.
Right. Well, I think we go back to that idea of that two-part nature of the human being, and it comes back to a sort of um, an understanding of human being as being formed in utero, if you will, through the joining together of a spark from the really from the earth and from the spiritual realm. You know, whereas in Western culture, the mind is sort of seen as associated with the brain, and then you've got that mind body split. In Maori culture, the human being sits at the kind of hub between all of these huge cosmic dipoles, I call them, or po in te reo, uh, such as, life and death, ora mate, night and day, uh, good and evil. All of those sorts of, there are all these kinds of dualities and complementarity. So, this is my sense that, and it all comes down to the kind of framework of ontological reality, which is based on the cosmogenic narratives, which of course have become very famous and long since entered into the public domain. And I'm sure you'll have heard of them, Lewis. The Rangi and Papa, the separation of Earth Mother and Sky Father, and all of their children were crouched between them until the god of forests and humanity managed to throw their father up into the sky so that light was able to enter the world. So there is definitely that duality. So the idea is that when a child is conceived, a spark from the atua or from rangi kind of combines with a spark from uh, the Earth Mother, the whenua, and then creates that kind of two-part person. So my point is that whereas mind body is split, is there's this internal split in the subject, in the Western subject, in the Maori way of thinking, the split is externalized and seen as not only cosmic but also psychological and spiritual kind of dualities, where the trick to good living is to maintain balance between all of those dualities, and that is what mana really means, is the ability to hold all of those metaphysical and cosmic and psychological dualities in equilibrium.
So I've been told that tapa refers to an being out of balance with what's around one. Is that accurate?
What was that word again? Sorry.
Tapa, the
Tapa.
the one that's usually translated as taboo.
Oh, tapu.
Tapu, sorry.
Yeah, no, well, tapu and noa is one of those dualities, those kind of spiritual dualities. Tapu really means restricted and set apart, and noa means common or able to be accessed by freely. But this is what I referred to before as needing to peel back the layers, because the incursions of Christianity, Christianity was a very big early influence. I mean, missionaries taught Māori to read really early on because they wanted them to read the Bible. And um, that idea of tapu was equated with sacred in the Christian sense. So it's been subject to a lot of, these Māori concepts have become in themselves colonized. So the work for someone like myself, or that I sort of try and take on, is to reread and read past those Western, distortions of the indigenous traditions. So I don't agree. I don't agree with that reading of tapu, that it means out of balance. I don't know if you've heard of this other word, utu, which is usually translated as revenge, but in actual fact, utu means balance. So I don't know what, it doesn't seem to be a word that would have an opposite, but definitely that idea of balance is important.
So I wonder, so in the Lakota view of self, the self exists between things. So between people, between, in the relationship, and not necessarily in the physical body of the person. And I wondered if there's any similar concept to that in Maori.
I don't think you can understand anything about Māori without understanding whakapapa. And if you understand whakapapa quite fully, then I came to call whakapapa the master concept of Māori philosophy, because it is not only a framework for understanding reality, but also a framework for ethical right action. So whakapapa is sort of is usually translated as meaning genealogy, but it is so much more than that. And the cosmogenic narratives that I've already referred to, beginning with Rangi and Papa, are in themselves whakapapa stories. They are stories of human relationships. So I'm connecting with your Lakota example in saying that a person was understood in terms of their whakapapa. And I think of it a little bit like a fishing net, where each individual was like that knot. So in that way, you're not really anything. I mean, a knot in a fishing net cannot exist without the rest of the net. So a personal identity was very much constructed from who your ancestors were, who you're related to, and seeing the person as a vessel of whakapapa in terms of their contribution to the future of the iwi, of the people.
Mm. So would whakapapa be sort of all of the contributions of the ancestors moving forward?
Yes. Actually, this is really interesting, because you know how we normally draw a family tree with sort of straight lines and, vertically. But in the traditional iconography, whakapapa was represented by a double helix spiral design with chevrons to show each generation. And so the convergence with the structure of the DNA molecule, which also is a double helix with kind of connecting links, as we know, is remarkable, because DNA really is sort of like the biological carrier of our whakapapa, of our ancestors,
Indeed.
in a way.
Yeah, and I read that trees and DNA all follow the Fibonacci sequence in terms of their spiraling, which is really profound, I think.
It is.
Yeah, yeah. So, um, so I'm trying to conceptualize, I'm looking at sort of cross indigenous cultures, notions of mind and well-being, because I don't want to say mental health, because that's already falling into Eurocentric thinking of silos of mind, body, spirit, etc. So I'm struggling even with what to call it, but I'm wondering how do Maori get to that concept of what is mental health and what is mental distress, or what is emotional health and what is emotional distress?
Yeah, thinking about, you're right. It's difficult to talk about these ideas framed within our modern kind of way of thinking without kind of distortion. But I believe that if we think about indigenous, pre-European, pre-contact ideas, that mental health resides in the ability to maintain in balance all of those dualities. So, and um, there are accounts that were written down in early contact days about this, about the dualities and the space between them where they all cross over. So, I mean, Lewis, I've kind of just imagined the metaphor of a spinning bicycle wheel, where you have the spokes, and then the hub at the center that doesn't move, in as much as the outside part of the wheel. So where the spokes are sort of like these dualities, and the hub is, there was a specific name for it, which is the PAE, PAE, a word that's also used to mean the horizon or the ridge of a mountain range. But in this case, it meant that space between the dualities when everything was in balance. And that was said to be the realm of human agency. So I think that's interesting because if we understand the world in this way and understand that our actions as human beings have have an impact on that balance between those cosmic dualities, then it points towards that idea of living in a healthy relationship with one's cultural and physical environment. So I suppose, and I haven't really thought about it in these terms before, but if we, given the holism that is inherent within Indigenous thinking, including Maori thinking, if we are keeping the God, and I mean, it was expressed in words that we can translate in a sort of a superficial way of keeping the gods happy, if you will, right? So that was not only to maintain good relationships, such as with the forest, so that one would be able to catch birds, and the sea to be able to catch seafood. But I think that we can see that for Indigenous Maori and in Indigenous Maori terms, health of the environment, physical health, and psychological or mental health pretty much all um, go together.
Right, right. And and so we're part of what we're trying to do is to think about, if indigenous people had invented psychiatry, what would it look like? And we've been talking about how it would have more verbs than nouns. And it would be talking about processes unfolding in the midst of interconnected networks of relationship in which the person is one node of, of a network, and that there would be a certain level of which we can't comprehend because of the invisible involvement, the involvement of spirits and even processes that we call random, which may or may not be random. Is there something similar in Maori thought?
Well, I was thinking about the recourse to what we call tohunga, which really translates as experts, but the word has been translated by missionaries and so forth to mean priest, inverted commas. So there are some interesting accounts of how if somebody was facing some kind of spiritual danger or worried about going into a situation of physical danger, that they might consult with the tohunga, with the expert, who would then undertake certain ceremonies and use oral kind of appeals to the gods to help that person. And another thing, which I think is probably also similar for other Indigenous cultures, is that there was one word that was used to mean both space and time. So obviously spatially we can physically map out a sort of a spatial um, distance, and then that was almost used metaphorically to intervene in the temporal, i.e., in the future, the imminent danger. So, for instance, one of those, which there was a tradition that was recorded and that was seen by the early ethnographers in the early colonial times as completely bizarre. And these sorts of things, anthropologists who studied Indigenous peoples all over the world, when they came upon something that they couldn't explain in their own framework, was taken to be proof of the fact that Indigenous people couldn't think properly or all of those sorts of things. And this particular ritual that I'm referring to was to do with biting the latrine beam. So in the pre-European Māori village, at one edge, usually over where there was the edge of the village and a sort of a cliff, there would be a horizontal beam erected, which served as the latrine. And that area was held as being deeply imbued with spiritual forces and with tapu and noa, the part before, in front of the latrine, being tapu, and on the other side of the latrine being noa. So this idea of biting the latrine beam, so the latrine beam itself was sort of like the boundary between all of these dipoles and tapu and noa. So with appropriate rituals, the person seeking spiritual guidance was involved in that kind of thing. So I thought that was an interesting example of how that kind of spatial divide became almost a metaphorical intervention into a temporal divide.
Mm-hmm. So the another thing that interests me is the sort of fluid boundaries of the Lakota self, for instance, that spirits flow in and out, that there's conversations occurring among the characters of the mind, those beings that we've incorporated and built models to use in our simulations to determine what behavior we might want to have with them, how I might want to approach my boss for a week off, um, this notion of a repertoire of stories about how to function in the world, and maybe not so much abstraction and cataloging of those stories, but they're being able to hear when needed. And I wonder, does that make sense from a Maori perspective?
Well, yes, insofar as I have come to think about these nature narratives of these cosmogenic kind of stories, creation stories, as not only explaining how the world works, but also guiding ethical behaviour in the world. And another thing that I've thought about in relation to what you've just said is comes back to the idea of time as spiral, which again is held in common with many other indigenous traditions. And one of the ideas in Maori around that is this idea of mata ora, which is where the ancestor can collapse space time and become co present with their descendants. And really, when you think about it, if time is a spiral, then there's a very short line. It's almost like a short circuit of the spiral, this idea of mata ora. And it was also um, seen as the kind of um, particularly, some children are just throwbacks, aren't they? And certain children were seen as almost a particular ancestor born again, so to speak.
Right.
Now, but and speaking more generally in Maori culture, rituals of encounter are terrifically important, as I'm sure they are in most Indigenous traditions, so that when a group is coming towards another uh, group, there are sort of ceremonial ways to acknowledge the fact that the people, the physical people who are coming, are also carrying their ancestors with them. So the calling, for example, is calling not so much to the people themselves, but to the ancestors that they carry with them. And that is where there is said to be a state of tapu. Oh, okay, I think that's what you're meaning about the unbalanced, because a tapu, a state of tapu, is a kind of spiritually charged. So it is a bit like, I have compared it with a sort of like the electric charge that you get within an atom, because I I did my first couple of degrees in chemistry, so my metaphors tend to come from chemistry. But that idea of tapu is almost like an electric charge, because, of course, in chemical terms, that's what makes a substance able to react and sort of to produce, a new chemical substance. It has to have that kind of charge. So tapu is a bit like that. I suppose it is a kind of a spiritual imbalance that sets up the situation to move towards a new state.
Yeah, yeah,
That's a good connection.
yes, yes. So what about the idea of this, is there this relational idea of the self? Does that map onto Maori philosophy, that the self exists as something in between all of the relationships that one has with all of the beings with whom one relates?
Absolutely. And that comes down to that other concept, mana,
Mhm.
that a person has mana, but partly by virtue of who they are in terms of their whakapapa, their genealogy, their lineages, and their relationships with others. Also, partly through their own actions and their ability to keep all of the dualities in balance, or the gods appeased, if you want to put it in that kind of language. And in those days, you were nothing without your social group. So mana was seen as something that you could gain through social service, I guess. So in a non-money society, social relationships are far more than just for recreation or pleasure, right? They are absolutely essential to one's survival, and therefore also to one's sense of identity. It's through whakapapa that through whakapapa came things like who you could marry, who were going to be your life companions, where you could live. So many aspects of the person's richness, if you will, in both physical and social terms and economic terms,
Mm-hmm.
derive through these kind of central ideas. So the number of sort of genuine Indigenous Maori concepts that we can kind of study is relatively small, but I find that taken together, they provide a fairly robust kind of worldview that is quite different from Western, and that sort of resources that sense of identity as being other, you know, that kind of mental escape hatch that I mentioned before. The ability to look at the world around us today, the world of 2021, in which, as Indigenous people, we're kind of forced to operate, right? But we can recognise that, but yet stand apart from it, and I think that in itself is an enriching um, circumstance. Or I feel lucky to be Indigenous myself. I don't know about you.
Oh, indeed, indeed. And I think perhaps it was our parents who struggled with the stigma and the oppression, or grandparents, but
Yes.
it's a,
Well, in my case, my parents. I mean, my father was born in 1927. He, like his peers, knew nothing of the world of English until was 5 and went to school, where they were physically punished for speaking a word of their own home language. So, I mean, these are not. This is another one of the another one of the myths that mainstream New Zealand culture wants to tell itself, that this all happened a very long time ago, and it's all in the past, and no such thing as Māori these days. And it's very much a kind of almost like a spiritual annihilation to say to people that you can't, you have to give away your own identity. So, I mean, I myself have been, I think my people, and I certainly have personal, this resonates with my personal experience of my life, have been subject to this unrelenting pressure to assimilate. I'm not sure how, I think is that the case for your people as well?
oh, absolutely unrelenting, and especially in the university setting, in the educational settings, the emphasis on Eurocentric thought is almost absolute, and the permission to engage in Indigenous philosophizing or thinking is dismissed for the most part. I mean, obviously not in a Native Studies department, but in the rest of the academy, yes. And however, it's wonderful that we get this little corner of the university to think differently. And it reminds me of something that came up today. So we were talking about sociological theory, and and particularly we were talking about Liddens, who has this notion of balancing agency and sort of compulsory behavior based on one's position in the social network. And I was saying, come on, this is just the story that each of us sit on a separate node in grandmother spider web, in the spider web that holds the world together. And we've been thinking this for 1,000 years at least. And how come you don't reference us? Because we came before you. So you figured out that it's not all agency and it's not all compulsion from the social system. Well, we knew that a long time ago. And you think this is so new and cool, but shouldn't you notice us and what we thought? And I don't know if you've had similar experiences, but
I think we have. I think in New Zealand, as opposed to Aotearoa, there has always been an interest in mining Maori culture for how it might advantage the local English-derived culture. There's been this kind of historical demand, really a command to provide the Maori point of view on any particular topic of social or academic interest, educational interest. And while I think that has given us as a country, I actually think it's given us a bit of an edge. The fact that we have, as unbalanced and hierarchical as it is, that kind of constant appeal to the Maori point of view has been a little bit of an X factor that has actually assisted and resourced mainstream thinking in this country. But it sits within this overall narrative. I mean, as you probably are well aware, Lewis, my country was one of the last of the lands to be invaded by the British colonisers. And there's no doubt that the way that it was done here was never any wish to commit genocide on my ancestors, but rather to assimilate. So a kind of a cultural genocide. So Maori were kind of inserted into the like a ready-made proletariat class or working class into the emerging modern economy. Yeah, I forgot where we started with that, but it is a different relationship. That this, not only are Indigenous people vastly different around the world, but the relationship between the Indigenous and the settler although it takes a different form, but of course it all draws on the same racist vocabulary of white supremacy, really. I mean, people get very affronted by those kinds of statements, but it's pretty hard to avoid if you just look at the situation logically.
right, or at least European supremacy, which sort of equates to that, given the state of Milan in Europe.
The state of
Melanin, the skin, the pigment that colors the skin. Yeah.
Yeah. Although, I mean, that's right. I mean, white, color racism, what they call color racism, is actually a relatively recent invention, isn't it?
It is indeed. I think probably dating from, say, 1800 would be my guess. Because previously slavery and really colonization and enslavement was an equal skin color opportunity. And in fact, the word slave in the English language refers to Slavic people who were the slaves of the time, once upon a time, before it turned to Africa.
Mm.
And
Yeah, well, I've read a little bit of books like The Wages of Whiteness and that kind of thing, who talk about that, the kind of imposition of a color racism in order to sort of create white sort of unity in the United States, and allow white working class people to see themselves as superior to blacks.
right.
And I
Well,
mean, I think, the US really does stand out in the world, as having kind of held on to those ideas so strongly. And I mean, it's a big place, and I've everywhere that I went, because I visited in 2019, everywhere that I've been in the States has probably been these little liberal pockets. But one is struck at the election, for example, how um, the party vote was almost a rural urban kind of, almost totally split down rural urban lines.
right, right. And to a large extent, education lines. And um, it's as if there are two populations in this country, in the United States.
It's very sad to see the polarization along political grounds like that. Yeah, we
Indeed.
feel sorry for you.
Thank you. Thank you. We need all the prayers that we can get, especially going into the 2022 elections when the Republicans hope to take over again and block all social programs, and that's a kind of interesting contrast with indigenous philosophy too, that whole mindset of pretending that um, no one is disadvantaged from the get-go and no one needs any support to arrive at an equal opportunity landscape, and that the whole notion of social capital doesn't exist, or cultural capital doesn't exist. Well, and for that matter, economical capital doesn't exist, and that everyone is equal, at birth, which we know is completely false. But that's the Republican narrative. Or,
Mm,
or that Jesus put you where you're supposed to be and you should stay there, which is the other version of it.
yeah. Or the idea that wealthy people deserve their wealth because they've worked so hard.
Right. Or Jesus meant them to be wealthy. That's the other story that goes on here.
Mm,
I feel like we, as a culture, we need to apologize to Jesus for all of the things we've laid upon whatever Jesus is, or whomever it is, he is. Um, we've certainly cast much in that direction.
mm. Whereas, coming back to what we were saying about the sort of the extreme racism that we see in a distressingly, frequent number of incidents in the United States, and it's quite different here, Lewis. It's very socially unacceptable to be overtly racist. By I make that statement given that when given the sort of like the amount of media attention that is given to the occasional verbal racist attack. There was a young waitress, Maori, who there were some Maori words, I think, in the menu, and she pronounced them as you would according to Maori pronunciation, and the table of businessmen chucked off at her and said, I suppose, you wouldn't be, your family wouldn't be able to afford to eat here. I suppose they're all at home eating boil up, just sort of silly stuff, really. And probably they were under the influence of alcohol, but it was upsetting. And my point is that even though that seems like a fairly mild event, it sort of gained national traction in the media, and because these business people, they knew which company they were from because they booked the table under that. So there was, there were repercussions for that company,
About
and an apology was made to the restaurant, and the restaurant owner, supported his staff member. So it is not. Oh, so the point I wanted to make is that although that kind of overt racist statement is socially unacceptable in public in this country, there and although relationships between Indigenous Māori people and the white people in this country are cordial, genial. There's free mixing, and a lot of people who visit here are sort of inclined to think that there is no racism, but it is there. It's very subtle. It operates on a very subtle level, and of course we see it in social media because people, people bring out their worst, don't they, on social media? So there are a number of sites. But one of the things that worries me is that at the moment, the sort of the temper of the times in this country is to introduce Māori language and culture. It's kind of become a craze, really, for introducing Māori language, culture, and knowledge into all aspects of education, schooling, tertiary, research, and so on and so forth. But what worries me about that is it seems to me that the more that we make apparent advances towards that, it seems to also bring with it an increase in the backlash. So it's almost like advancement for minority, in this case Maori, aspirations, inevitably causes more that resentment to come out into the, out of hiding, as it were.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, and I think that this sort of settler colonial capitalism that's still upon us invokes competition, and we're all afraid that somebody will get a better seat at the table, or a better room at the hotel, or a better seat on the airplane, and therefore we're suspicious of each other as opposed to being collaborative.
Yeah. Well, in this country, there are a couple of kind of sturdy racist myths that they're so embedded that it's not socially acceptable, really, even to declare them, but they kind of underlay everything. And it's that idea that that European knowledge is superior to, and Māori knowledge is inferior. And that kind of goes with the language, the culture. Everything Māori is seen as inferior to everything that originates in Europe. And most of the time, you don't even have to discuss it because our country is so thoroughly modernized. And like you just said, everything Indigenous is so buried and kind of out of sight. But as initiatives move towards greater public awareness, like on media, and that sort of thing, it does inspire that sort of backlash.
Well, and I think that's the next frontier is the frontier of intellectual inferiority and methodological inferiority. And I suspect the woman Smith. I'm forgetting her first name.
Linda Tuhiwai Smith.
Yes, in indigenizing methodology, and I suspect that's the next frontier, is to struggle within the university, within the sort of intellectual arena, for at least equivalency. And in North America, we're calling it two-eyed seeing, which was a term invented by Albert Marshall, who's a Mi'kmaq elder from Nova Scotia, Canada. And it's the idea that Indigenous ways of thinking are equal equally valid to any other way of thinking, and that they don't have to be reduced. They don't need to, indigenous theory doesn't need to be explainable by scientific theory.
Mm,
It can
yeah.
coexist.
Yeah, like I've been caught up for quite a while, really, in the debate between science and Māori knowledge. And there's this kind of very, just kind of um, zero sum kind of, it's an either or kind of, as if it's a simple question. And yeah, so let's not go there. That's boring. But one of the reasons why I look at Māori philosophy is because I'm thinking about my philosophical rights, to think not, I mean, in this country, I have every legal right to self identify my ethnicity as Maori. But with that, I take it that I also have a philosophical right to think Maori, to think as Maori, and to think with Maori cognitive resources. So, in terms of, because I think you talked about decolonization. That was sort of um, the theme that you sort of approached me with, and I was thinking about how does Māori philosophy relate to decolonization, and it really does in terms of it's at that intellectual or symbolic cultural level, whereas decolonization is also, of course, required at the more overt level of our legal system and, dare we say it, economic equality. And I guess I sort of feel that as an educator and as someone who's interested in sort of working with knowledge, I'm not working in that kind of like in the legal system or the economic system, but I am working in the kind of symbolic system. So that's where, for me, Māori philosophy is a kind of a philosophical form of decolonizing my thinking.
Right. And for me, I'm working mostly in the mental health arena and trying to undo the reification of suffering that the Eurocentric vision has produced, and to return it to a sense of dynamic process of imbalances and disharmonies, you know, um, in the context of trauma and power imbalances and things like that, and take it out of the labeling paradigm and into the sort of dynamic unfolding paradigm. And that's my sense of decolonization, is to undo the reification, which serves settler colonial capitalism well, because they can sell stuff, but it doesn't necessarily make people feel much better. And I'm, I don't know, does that connect with anything that's happening in your world in New Zealand?
Well, very much, because in a way, the Māori view on any topic is incommensurable with that kind of profit, money, um, objectification system. So we're always going to have those um, points of conflict or lack of understanding. And you're right to use the word suffering, because it does cause suffering. I mean, we in this country, we've been through this neoliberal reform. It sort of started in the 80s, and it's kind of still churning its way through our various systems. And one of the things that's happened as a result is the ridiculous price of houses now, and that in itself has led to the creation of a sort of underclass that never existed before. Prior to 1980, this country was quite egalitarian, and although there was rich people and poor people, but there was really no homelessness. Uh, and the fact that that those problems have been brought about in the last 30 years or so, as a through a process whereby the already wealthy have further enriched themselves at the expense of mostly Maori and other Pacific brown families who are now struggling like never before. So it's very sad, and to be honest, this virus that we're all faced with now has tested those, testing our systems and our abilities as human society to, to even keep ourselves alive. Very, very troubling times.
Indeed. And it brings to mind, that if one looks at nature, and I'm thinking of a book that I recently read, The Mushroom at the End of the World. The nature is collaborative, and it's through collaboration that survival occurs, which I think is a fundamental principle of Indigenous philosophy. And yet it's through greed and competition that people become homeless and the rich get richer. And it's probably not in the service of human survival. I'm sure the planet will be fine without us, but it just seems sad and tragic that this is going on.
Well, that's a depressing place, but it might be sort of the place to finish. Do you think?
It could be. We can finish on a sad note. Indeed. Yes. Well, thank you. Yes.
Yeah. No. I mean, I guess not much really has been left to us as Indigenous people, except our difference.
Mhm.
So vive la différence, and I certainly have found investigating Māori knowledge from a sort of an insider point of view extremely rewarding. And and even, I mean, talk about decolonization. I mean, I'm 60 now, so I'm sort of getting towards the end of my career, but I'm still finding myself um, realizing that there is more, like this idea of whakapapa that I've mentioned, which is a huge subject. And I wrote a paper recently about whakapapa as an ethical measure of time. And I thought about thinking of myself as a scholar of whakapapa. And I realized that I've only just decolonized myself to the point that I could even think about that. Because prior to that, I had grown up and in a sort of a Western education system in which these Maori ideas have been so sort of shut down and delimited. And it's only really when you actually study them and spend time with them that you come to appreciate just how expansive and productive and generative they are, which is really what we're saying, what we've been saying all throughout this conversation, I think. But I mean, I mean, without wanting to be a hero, I think it's important for even for people like ourselves to admit to seeing our own continuing process of decolonizing our thinking.
True. Very
That
definitely.
might be a more optimistic place to stop.
Okay. Yes. We will continually decolonize and write about it. And maybe someone will read the papers. Well, I read your papers, so someone is reading the papers.
My book has sold extremely well, actually. I'm really surprised at how much interest it generated. mean, that's one of the things, as you would know, because I did look you up online, and I saw that you've published a lot of books. So I suppose you would know what I mean when you say, when you write a book and you put it out there, and you don't always know who is going to find value in it, do you?
Right, you don't. And I'm still at the level where if somebody tells me if they read my book, I'm thrilled.
Yeah,
Oh, thank you.
absolutely.
Right, right, right. Yeah. Well, and I've been diving into your book, and I'm enjoying it very much. And I think that that it's hard to compete in the capitalistic marketplace of many promises that one can never deliver in terms of books. And so I've certainly shared your book with all the students, and hopefully we'll all benefit from each other's thoughts. And
Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate sharing
thank
it
you.
like that.
Yes, yes. And maybe we'll get a chance to meet in person someday in at Aurora
Yes,
once it
let's
opens.
hope so.
There's a theory that it will someday open again.
Let's hope so.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. It's a great compliment to the reading of your work to actually be able to talk to you. And I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
All right. Well, good night, or well, good day, I should say.
Bye now. Bye
Okay.
bye.
Bye.